If you want to understand one of history's absolute greatest warriors, a guy named Khalid ibn al-Walid, you first have to understand the world he was born into. And that means we need to challenge a story that, let's be honest, most of us were taught in school. The story of Western civilization and this thing we call the Dark Ages. So let's just get right into it.
You know, the way we often learn history comes through a really specific, kind of modern, Eurocentric lens. And as Dr. Roy Casagrande points out, this view basically tries to cut Western civilization off from its actual roots. You know, the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's like history just packed its bags, left the Middle East, and set up shop permanently in Europe. But that's just not how it happened. And this creates a huge misunderstanding of what the world really looked like back in the 7th century.
And yeah, this slide just says it all, doesn't it? When we hear Dark Age, we picture mud, filth, a total lack of progress. But that was really just a European problem. At the very same time, the Middle East, the literal birthplace of Western Civ, was, well, pretty civilized. They had streets lit with oil lamps, they had complex indoor plumbing for both freshwater and sewage. The level of infrastructure was something Europe wouldn't even dream of for hundreds of years. So the darkness, it was a local issue, not a global one. Okay, so on this world stage, who were the main players? Well, there were two absolute titans, two colossal superpowers, and they were locked in a rivalry that had pretty much defined the known world for centuries. No, that is not a typo, 700 years. I mean, think about that. That's a war that would stretch from the days of knights and castles all the way to right now. Generations of people were born, lived their entire lives, and died, knowing nothing but this constant, grinding war between the Roman and Persian empires. It was the ancient world's forever war. It was everything.
Right, and the key thing to get here is that these weren't young, energetic empires. The Romans had been an empire for 900 years. The Persians, an unbelievable 1,200 years. They were ancient, they were powerful, sure. But after 7 centuries of just beating the tar out of each other, they were both completely and utterly exhausted. They were drained of money, people, and energy.
But that endless war, it wasn't the only thing killing them. In fact, it wasn't even the worst thing. Something much quieter, much more sinister, was eating both empires alive from the inside out.
That's right. The thing that really kicked off the downfall of these two superpowers wasn't an army, it wasn't a rebellion, it was a grain. Believe it or not, the story of their collapse begins with some Indonesian fishermen and the spread of rice.
What's so wild about this is how it all connects. It's like this slow-motion disaster. You've got Indonesian sailors who manage to get to Madagascar, and they bring rice with them. From there, rice cultivation spreads to Africa and eventually makes its way all across the Middle East and Southern Europe. So what's the problem? Well, to grow a lot of rice, you have to flood the fields with water. And those massive, warm, flooded fields were the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes carrying malaria. A disease that was once pretty contained suddenly just exploded across the entire civilized world. And the impact was just, wow. It was a demographic nightmare. Across this whole huge area, from Spain all the way to Iran, the average life expectancy was practically cut in half. It went from a respectable 45 years old down to just 25. An entire generation just got wiped out by the slow-moving plague.
So picture this. You've got two empires, already on their last legs from centuries of war, now completely hollowed out by this endemic disease. They were staggering. They were on the ropes. And then the knockout blow landed.
It's called the Justinian Plague. This was an outbreak of the exact same bubonic plague, the Black Death, that would return to devastate Europe 800 years later. And when this plague hit the already sick and weakened populations of the 6th century, the result was a catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. And we're not talking about a slow decline here. The bubonic plague moves with absolutely terrifying speed. We're talking about a massive chunk of the human race being wiped off the map in the span of just a year or two.
In Europe alone, it's estimated that 40% of the entire population died. Just let that sink in for a second. In any group of 10 people you know, 4 of them would be gone. It's a level of societal collapse that we can barely even comprehend.
And as horrific as that is, in the heartlands of the Roman and Persian empires, the Middle East and North Africa, it was even worse. A jaw-dropping 60% of the population was wiped out. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless. Imagine looking around your town, your city, and seeing that more than half the people are just gone. That was their reality. So what happens when a disaster like that hits? Well, everything that makes a society run just breaks. With way fewer people, there's less food being grown. Your armies get smaller and weaker because there's nobody to recruit, and your entire economy just falls off a cliff. The whole system just falls apart.
So this is the world on the eve of the 7th century, a world that might have looked powerful on a map, but if you looked closer, you'd see it was fragile, shattered, and just barely holding on.
And this is the most important thing to remember. Rome and Persia weren't really conquered by an outside force. They had collapsed from within. They were ravaged by war, decimated by malaria, and then completely shattered by the plague. They were empires in name only. They were hollowed out shells, just waiting for a final push. So, an empty stage had been set. The great powers that had dominated the world for more than 1,000 years were now just shadows of what they once were. And into this huge power vacuum, from a place nobody was looking, a brand new force was about to appear. The question wasn't if these old empires would fall, but who was going to be there to take their place.